There is a border inside your body. You cannot feel it. No instrument can locate it, but it is there written into your chromosomes by 40,000 years of contact, survival, and slow disappearance. Every person alive today whose ancestry traces outside of Africa carries fragments of Neanderthal DNA, still shaping how you feel pain, how your immune system responds, possibly how deeply you sleep on a winter night. The Neanderthal is not gone. It is folded into billions of living people, quietly functional, mostly invisible. But here is what took decades to understand. The Neanderthal DNA stops. At one specific region, it nearly vanishes. Not a gradual fade, a border. Geneticists call it an archaic desert. For years, the explanation seemed obvious. Those genes were toxic. Evolution edited out the incompatible paragraphs. That explanation was wrong. What the data reveals is something stranger and far more human, not biological failure, something behavioral, something social, a pattern of ancient contact, repeated and asymmetrical, between populations teetering at the edge of survival. The invisible border in your DNA is not a wall built by evolution. It is a record of who approached whom and what it cost. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments and tell me, what do you think actually helped early humans survive? Because the answer is not what anyone expected. 40,000 years ago, Eurasia was not a continuous human world. It was a series of ecological islands separated by expanding ice sheets, collapsing grasslands, rivers that shifted course across generations, and coastlines that could rise or fall by hundreds of feet within a few centuries. To survive in that world required more than mobility. It required staying connected. Groups needed enough contact with neighboring populations to exchange mates, knowledge, and genetic diversity before isolation quietly became lethal. This is the world Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. Not as primitive creatures, as specialists, cold-adapted, landscape-literate, capable hunters operating inside deeply regional survival systems built from generations of accumulated knowledge. They understood the migration routes of large animals, the seasonal behavior of rivers, the difference between a winter that could be outlasted and one that could not. And for long periods, they survived remarkably well. But surviving inside a stable system is entirely different from surviving inside a collapsing one. When Homo sapiens began moving out of Africa in significant numbers, something changed in the structure of Eurasian contact networks. The two populations met, not once, repeatedly, over thousands of years, across dozens of ecological corridors from the Levant to the Siberian steppe. And those meetings were intimate enough to produce children whose descendants are alive today. The genome holds every record of those encounters, which makes what the genome is missing the most important part of the story. The old maps of human evolution were too clean. Africa, migration, replacement. Modern humanity emerging alone on the far side of a great transition. But ancient DNA turned that story into something messier and far more recognizably human. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo sapiens, and possibly other populations whose names we will never know overlapped across Eurasia for tens of thousands of years. They did not exist in sealed compartments. They exchanged genes, they exchanged children, and they did so under pressure, climate pressure, resource pressure, the relentless arithmetic of small populations trying to avoid reproductive collapse. Because small populations disappear in ways that large ones never have to think about. A few failed winters, a hunting territory that collapses, a generation without enough contact with neighboring groups to maintain genetic diversity, and a lineage begins failing from the inside, not dramatically, not visibly, but structurally. Birth rates tighten, options narrow, the margin for error disappears. This may be why the strongest signals of ancient interbreeding appear precisely during periods of environmental stress. Not peaceful integration, not curiosity. Exhausted populations meeting other exhausted populations at the edge of what their systems could bear, sometimes violently, sometimes cooperatively, sometimes intimately enough to change the genetic future of both lineages. The invisible border in the genome did not emerge from biology alone. It emerged from who was desperate enough, isolated enough, close enough to make contact, and who was not. When researchers began mapping exactly where Neanderthal ancestry appears in modern human genomes, a specific pattern emerged. Most chromosomes carried at least some Neanderthal signal, scattered, modest, but consistent. Then came the X chromosome, and the signal nearly disappeared. A desert, one of the most gene-dense regions of the human genome, carrying hundreds of sequences tied to immunity, fertility, and neurological function, and the Neanderthal had left almost nothing there. The first explanation was intuitive. Those variants were incompatible. When two lineages diverge for hundreds of thousands of years and then hybridize, the combinations sometimes fail. Offspring carry genetic interactions that impair fertility or survival. Natural selection removes those sequences quickly. The X chromosome, present in only one copy in males, would amplify any such a harmful variant, with no backup, no buffer. Male hybrids carrying Neanderthal X chromosome sequences might have been less fertile. Their lines would have ended. The desert would form within a few generations. For a decade, this model held. Then researchers looked at the Neanderthal genomes themselves, and the desert inverted. Neanderthal X chromosomes were not empty of foreign DNA. They were flooded with it. Modern human sequences appeared on Neanderthal X chromosomes at 62% above baseline levels compared to the rest of the genome. If the desert existed because X chromosome gene interactions were genuinely toxic, symmetrically, biologically, human DNA should have been purged from Neanderthal X chromosomes with equal force. It wasn't, which meant the barrier was never biological. The barrier was behavioral, and behavior, in the Ice Age, meant something far more fragile and contingent than a genetic incompatibility. To read what the pattern actually says, you need to understand how X chromosomes move between generations. Females inherit 2 X chromosomes, one from each parent. Males inherit 1 X, always from their mother, and a Y from their father. This asymmetry means that the direction of ancient mating, which sex, from which population, initiated contact, leaves a measurable signature in the genome thousands of years later. The 62% excess of human DNA on Neanderthal X chromosomes points to one specific pairing, repeated across time. Neanderthal males crossing into contact with human females, not the reverse. Not symmetrically, a consistent, directional asymmetry encoded in molecular residue, still readable today. No ancient human understood this. No one stood in a valley knowing they were shaping the genomic future of a species. They were cold. They were hungry. They were operating inside survival systems that were already under pressure from every direction. What produced the pattern was not a cultural practice or a deliberate preference. It was the accumulated mathematics of who migrated, who stayed, whose social structures were open enough to allow contact, and whose were not. Thousands of individual decisions, none of them aware of the pattern they were building. "I find it extraordinary," said one Princeton geneticist reviewing the findings, "that we can use genome sequences to infer aspects of social dynamics and mating patterns that occurred tens to hundreds of thousands of years ago. What the genome is reading is not biology, it is behavior under pressure. And behavior under pressure is the most human thing there is." Here is the part that the fossil record alone could never tell you. By the time Homo sapiens began arriving in Neanderthal territories in force, the Neanderthals were already failing. Not because of anything modern humans had done. The failure was internal, structural. A population bottleneck, a sharp collapse in genetic diversity, appears in Neanderthal, remains approximately 110,000 years ago, long before the first sapiens crossed into Europe, long before any documented contact. The Neanderthal world was already narrowing, already operating on a reduced genetic library, already absorbing the compounding costs of small populations breeding inside shrinking networks. Estimates of total Neanderthal population across all of Eurasia range from 5,000 to 70,000 individuals. That is the size of a small city spread across an entire continent, divided into local groups that were often genetically isolated from one another. A Neanderthal community in Iberia had almost no reproductive connection to one in the Caucasus. Each group was its own fragile experiment in minimum viable survival, with no redundancy, no rescue population, no margin for a bad decade. They were not primitive. They were not weak. They were simply operating inside a system that had already lost too much of its elasticity. And when Homo sapiens networks larger, more connected, more geographically flexible, began overlapping with those fragmented Neanderthal communities, the outcome was not conquest, it was arithmetic. A slightly more resilient system gradually absorbing a slightly less resilient one, so slowly that no individual living through it would have perceived the scale of what was ending. The most haunting implication of the invisible border is not what it reveals about Neanderthals. It is what it reveals about the nature of disappearance itself. Extinction rarely arrives as a dramatic ending. Most of the time, systems collapse quietly, contact weakens, mate exchange narrows, birth rates decline, mobility shrinks, and the visible disappearance comes last, long after the hidden systems have already failed. What the archaeology records as a sudden absence is almost always the final stage of a slow structural unwinding that began generations earlier, invisible to everyone living through it. The Neanderthals did not know they were disappearing. A Neanderthal community in southern Iberia, sheltered in coastal caves, hunting ibex in the early winter, would have had no mechanism to understand that their population was functionally below recovery threshold, that the neighboring group they relied on for mates had already dissolved, that the next valley was now human territory, that the survival system they had inhabited for 200,000 years had quietly stopped working. They would have noticed the winter was colder, the herds were smaller, the neighboring group had not arrived, and then one season, the system simply could not close the gap. What looks from the outside like extinction felt, from the inside, like an ordinary winter that did not end. Some Neanderthal DNA did survive the crossing, not on the X chromosome, not in the regions governing male fertility, where archaic variants are almost entirely absent, but elsewhere scattered across other chromosomes, retained not by accident but by selection, because those specific fragments were useful in a new environment. Neanderthal immune variants helped hybrid descendants survive the pathogen landscapes of Eurasia, bacterial and viral environments that Homo sapiens had not co-evolved with in Africa. Neanderthal skin biology sequences may have accelerated adaptation to northern UV conditions. Some neurological variants persist to this day, still influencing how certain people process pain, regulate inflammation, or structure their sleep cycle. There is a widely documented Neanderthal-derived variant, carried by a substantial fraction of modern Europeans, associated with waking early. The Neanderthal may still be organizing your mornings. What was retained is a map of ancient necessity. What was lost tells a different story. The X chromosome desert was not created by selection. It was created by the mating asymmetry itself, by the fact that Neanderthal X chromosome sequences never entered the human population in sufficient numbers to even be evaluated. They were filtered out before selection could act, not because they were harmful, but because the behavioral pattern of contact ensured they rarely arrived in the first place. The border was not biological, it was social. And because it was social, it was contingent. It could have gone differently. The pattern could have been reversed. And if it had, the genome you carry today would be subtly, meaningfully, irreversibly different. That contingency is not a footnote, it is the entire point. The last Neanderthals did not disappear all at once. The archaeological signal fades at different times in different places, earlier in Central Europe, later along the Iberian coast, possibly later still in isolated pockets of the Caucasus. What looks from a distance like a single extinction event was actually a slow, geography by geography dissolution of a species that had already lost its internal coherence long before the final communities vanished. And the first modern humans in Europe were not conquerors. They were also small, also fragile. A genome recovered from early Sapiens in Germany, 45,000 years old, connects to a woman found 200 kilometers away in the Czech Republic, the same tiny, isolated population, spread thin across an unfamiliar continent, carrying their own reproductive vulnerabilities, their own uncertainty. The last Neanderthals and the first Europeans shared the same world for thousands of years, not in conflict, not in triumph, in proximity. In contact along contested ecological margins, both populations too small to feel dominant, both surviving season by season inside systems that offered no guarantees. What we call extinction was, for many individuals, something quieter, a slow absorption, a gradual loss of reproductive mass, until the boundary between one kind of human and another became too thin to maintain. The border was not crossed, it dissolved, and no one alive at the time knew what was ending. The invisible border still exists, not as a political line, not as a cultural memory, as a biological map, written in living tissue, still carried in every non-African genome on Earth. A record of Ice Age contact systems, which populations remained connected, which became isolated, which survived long enough to pass something forward. And perhaps what makes this story feel modern, uncomfortably modern, is not the science. It is the structure. Every system that allowed human populations to persist across the Ice Age was operating at its absolute margin. The redundancy was real, but thin. The networks were functional, but fragile. A few hundred early Europeans, a Neanderthal population the size of a small city scattered across a continent, contact events separated by generations, migration routes that opened for a century and then closed beneath rising water. The Neanderthals were not inferior. They were not less intelligent, less capable, less deserving of continuation. They were simply less connected. Their survival system had lost too much of its elasticity too long before the pressure arrived. And when the pressure came, there was nothing left to absorb it. That distinction between a system that holds and a system that fails is not a relic of the Pleistocene. It is the oldest pattern in human history. The genome remembers how close it was, how narrow the margin, how many things had to go slightly right, in the right order, in the right geography, for any of us to exist at all. Billions of people alive today carry the trace of a species that didn't survive, folded quietly into their immune systems, their sleep cycles, the precise way their bodies respond to cold. The Neanderthals are in us. What remains of them is small, but it is real, and it persists because some of those ancient encounters, in some of those collapsing Ice Age valleys, produced something that lasted. Not because it was inevitable, because it barely held. If this stayed with you, if the margin feels narrower than it did before, share it quietly with someone who might sit with it the same way. Prehistoric Shadows continues.